Welcome to True Crime Cases, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. Grayson and Eliza were the kind of couple that everyone in the neighborhood seemed to admire. They lived in a beautiful, two-story house on a quiet street where every lawn was perfectly mowed and these streets were lined with tall, shady trees. The people on their block liked to say they were lucky in life, always cheerful, polite, and good neighbors to everyone. Grayson was 39, tall and confident, with salt and pepper hair that made him look even more distinguished. He worked as a lawyer, and everyone knew he was successful with clients and cases that took him to far-off cities. Eliza was different. She was more of an artist type, kind, creative, and mysterious in her own way. She had a warm, friendly smile and loved to paint scenes from nature, often sitting outside on their back porch with her easel and brushes, making beautiful paintings of flowers and sunsets. To outsiders, their lives seemed perfect. They attended neighborhood barbecues and holiday parties, always bringing something delicious or creative. Eliza had a knack for cooking, and her desserts were famous. In the area, loved hosting art nights, where she invited neighbors over to paint or learn about different art styles. Her talent made her the talk of the town. Everyone knew her as the sweet, artsy lady who brought color to their community. Grayson, meanwhile, was known for his reliability and sharp mind whenever someone in the neighborhood had a legal question. Grayson was the first person they thought of. He would listen, offer advice, and even help out, often without charging a cent. Grayson was truly respected, almost like the wise counselor of the community. But despite all of this, there was a strange air about Eliza. She wasn't like the other neighbors in some ways. Sometimes she would seem distant, staring off into space or pausing in the middle of conversations. People sometimes joked that it was just her artistic spirit. But behind her friendly smile there was something hidden, a sense of mystery that no one could quite figure out. And though she was close to people in the neighborhood, she rarely shared much about her past. If anyone asked about her family or where she grew up, she would laugh it off or change the subject. Over time, the neighbors stopped asking, content just to enjoy her presence and her kindness. Grayson noticed this too, and at first he didn't think much of it. When they first met, he had been drawn to her unique personality, her spark, and her depth. Eliza had come into his life, unexpectedly lighting up his world with her creativity and joy. But as the years went on, he began to realize there were parts of Eliza he didn't fully know. She kept to herself in certain ways, sometimes even locking the door to her art studio for hours. Grayson respected her privacy, but he found it a little odd when he asked. She'd say she was working on something special, or just needed time alone to think. So he left it at that, thinking that was simply part of who she was. As time passed, those small things about Eliza's behavior became stranger. Sometimes Grayson would come home from work early and find her in the middle of a phone call that seemed tense. She'd quickly hang up and smile, brushing it off as just a call with an old friend. Occasionally he'd notice that she was more nervous or jittery than usual, glancing over her shoulder or checking the locks on the windows and doors. When he asked her about it, she'd say she was just being cautious or didn't want to take any chances. The neighbors never saw this side of Eliza, though to them she was still the delightful artist with a warm laugh, always ready to lend a hand or share her latest painting. Children in the neighborhood adored her. She'd let them help her paint little rocks in bright colors or create cards for their parents. Parents trusted her. She had a gentle way with kids, and everyone knew that she cared deeply for others. But beneath her kind nature there was still that hidden side of her that only Grayson glimpsed every now and then. One evening at a neighborhood gathering, Grayson overheard some of the neighbors talking about Eliza. They mentioned how talented she was and how lucky he was to have her as a wife. Grayson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and a hint of curiosity. Who really was Eliza, this woman who was both so close and yet so known to him? He couldn't remember a time she had shared about her life before him. Beyond a few vague stories here and there, the more he thought about it, the more questions bubbled up. Why did she avoid talking about her past? Why was she sometimes so guarded, so secretive? Grayson brushed it off, reminding himself that they all had parts of their lives they kept to themselves, but deep down he couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. Eliza was wonderful in every way, but there were moments when he felt like she was almost someone else. It was hard to describe, but he felt it growing in his mind like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. Little Did he know this was only the beginning? Soon Grayson would uncover things about his wife that he never expected, things that would turn his world upside down and make him question everything he thought he knew. The peaceful, picture-perfect life they'd built in their quiet, friendly neighborhood was about to change forever. And when the truth finally came, how there would be no going back over time. Grayson started noticing that Eliza wasn't quite the same person he thought he knew. It was small things at first, moments he could have easily brushed off, but each strange detail added up, creating a picture that Grayson couldn't ignore. One evening, Grayson came home from work a bit early. He'd been planning to surprise Eliza with dinner at a new restaurant she'd mentioned wanting to try. But when he walked into the house, he noticed the lights were dim and Eliza was sitting in the living room on the phone talking quietly. Her voice was low, almost like she didn't want anyone to overhear. The moment she spotted Grayson, she quickly ended the call, looking a bit startled. "Oh, you're home early," she said, her face shifting to a bright smile, but Grayson could sense her unease, a slight tenseness in her posture. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself she might have just been having a private conversation with a friend, but as he went to hang up his coat, he couldn't help but wonder who was on the other end of the line the next week. Grayson noticed Eliza started going out more often. Normally she spent her afternoons in her art studio painting or planning her art nights with the neighbors. But now she'd mentioned she had errands done and would be gone for hours. When Grayson asked where she went, she'd give a vague answer like, "Oh, just picking up some supplies or met with a friend for coffee." Grayson wanted to believe her, but it was odd. Eliza usually liked being at home, and these sudden trips didn't seem like her at all. One Saturday, Grayson decided to follow her. He felt guilty for even thinking about it, but his curiosity had grown too strong. Eliza left the house around noon, saying she'd be back by dinner. Grayson waited a few minutes, then got in his car and drove a few blocks behind her, trying to stay out of sight. After a while, he watched her turn into an unfamiliar part of town, somewhere they never usually went. She parked outside a small, run-down building that didn't look like any place she'd typically visit from his car. Grayson watched as Eliza went inside. He sat there for a while, his mind racing with questions. Who was she meeting here? What was this place? He felt a pang of guilt, thinking he shouldn't be spying on his own wife, but his instincts told him something was wrong. After about an hour, Eliza came back out, looking around quickly as if to make sure no one was watching. Grayson ducked down in his seat, his heart pounding. What was she hiding? That night, Grayson couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. He wanted to ask her directly, but worried it would push her further away. Instead, he kept his eyes open, hoping to piece together the mystery. Soon other little things started to stand out. Eliza, who was always careful with her art supplies, suddenly had a stack of new expensive brushes and paints. When he asked about them, she shrugged, saying they were just something she picked up, but Grayson knew her well enough to know that Eliza was usually pretty thrifty when it came to buying art supplies. And then there was the way she acted around the house. Sometimes she would jump when Grayson entered a room unexpectedly, or she'd lock the door to her studio, which she never used to do. Once, Grayson even noticed a small safe hidden under her painting table. He'd never seen it before, and when he asked about it, she got defensive, saying it was just personal stuff and that she needed her privacy. He tried to respect that, but the feeling in his gut kept telling him there was more to the story. The strangest moment came one evening when they were watching TV together. Eliza received a text message, and Grayson saw her face go pale as she read it without a word. She got up and left the room, taking her phone with her. Grayson stayed on the couch, pretending to focus on the show, but his mind was racing. After a few minutes, he couldn't help himself, tiptoed down the hallway to listen. Eliza was whispering on the phone, her voice tense and quiet. "No, I told you it has to stay between us. I don't want anyone finding out," she said, her words sharp and clipped. Grayson felt a chill run down his spine. He'd never heard Eliza talk like that before. She sounded serious, almost afraid. Almost when she came back into the room, she seemed distracted, barely looking at him. "Everything okay?" Grayson asked, trying to sound casual. Eliza forced a smile. "Oh yeah, just a friend, needing some advice," she replied. But Grayson could tell her mind was elsewhere. That night, as they went to bed, Grayson lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Eliza had always been so open with him, but now it was like she was slipping away into some secret life he knew nothing about. Had tried to push the thoughts from his mind, telling himself he was being paranoid, but with each day the distance between them grew and the questions in his head only grew louder. What was Eliza hiding one evening when Eliza was out on one of her mysterious errands? Grayson decided he could take the mystery anymore. His suspicions were eating him up inside, and he had to know what Eliza was hiding. He went into her art studio hoping he might find some answers. The room was filled with her paints, brushes, and half-finished canvases. But Grayson's eyes were drawn to the small safe he'd seen before hidden beneath her table. He knew he probably shouldn't open it, but he was desperate for answers. The safe was locked. But after searching through her drawers, he found a small key tucked away under some paintbrushes. Heart pounding, I unlocked the safe and opened it. Inside were stacks of documents, photos, and even a few passports. Grayson felt his hands tremble as he picked up one of the passports, flipping it open. The name wasn't Eliza. It was Julia Hayes, and the photo was of Eliza, his wife. Grayson's mind reeled. Why did she have a different name? Why would she need multiple passports? He started looking through the other documents. Some were old newspaper clippings about robberies in another state, all mentioning a woman who matched Eliza's description. There were police reports, one even showing a sketch that looked eerily like Eliza. Grayson felt like he was in a dream, a bad dream that he couldn't wake up from. His wife had a different identity, a different name, and according to these papers, she had been involved in some serious crimes. Grayson's heart pounded as he continued looking through the documents. He found one final paper, an arrest record from years ago. Eliza, or Julia, as he now knew her name to be, had been charged with theft and fraud, but had somehow gotten off on a technicality. Grayson felt a wave of emotions: shock, betrayal, and anger all at once. How could she have kept all of this from him? How could she have lied so completely? When Eliza finally came home that evening, Grayson was waiting for her. The documents spread out on the kitchen table. She froze when she saw them, her face going pale as she looked from the papers to Grayson's furious expression. Eliza, or should I say Julia, Grayson said, his voice trembling with anger. Care to explain any of this? Eliza's face was a mix of fear and guilt. She took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep herself calm. Grayson, I can explain, she said quietly, but he cut her off. Explain, he shouted. You lied to me about who you are. You have a different name, a different life, and a record. How could you keep all this from me? Eliza flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. I didn't want you to know because I was trying to leave that life behind, she said softly. Thought if I could start over, maybe I could finally live a normal life, a safe life. A safe life. Grayson scoffed. You think lying to me is safe? Hiding a criminal past is safe? I married you, Eliza. It rusted you, and you were hiding this huge part of your life from me. He could feel the anger boiling inside him, and he struggled to keep his voice steady. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth? Eliza looked down, tears welling up in her eyes. I was scared, Grayson. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want you to see me as Ace, that person, but you are that person. Grayson said, his voice full of bitterness. You were willing to lie to me for years. Did you even love me? Or was this all just part of your cover? Eliza's eyes flashed with hurt. Of course I love you, she said, her voice breaking. Everything I've done was to protect you, to protect us. I never wanted to be involved in that life. I didn't have a choice back then, but I chose to leave it all behind, and I chose you. Grayson shook his head, anger and sadness swirling in his chest. You should have trusted me with the truth. How can I believe anything you say now? Eliza wiped away a tear, her expression growing desperate. Grayson, please, I did what I thought was best. I wanted to build a life with you, a real life. I didn't want that past to ruin everything. But it already has. Grayson said, his voice low. He could barely stand to look at her. The woman he thought he knew, all the moments they'd shared, the memories they'd made. How much of it had been real? The tension between them was thick. Both of them feeling the weight of the truth that had finally come out. Eliza tried to reach out to him, but Grayson stepped back, unable to let her touch him. I need some time to think, he said, his voice cold and distant. Eliza nodded, understanding that she had shattered the trust they once had. Grayson turned and left the room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't know what to do or how to feel. All he knew was that Everything he thought he knew about his wife had just come crashing down, leaving him alone with his anger, his hurt, and the realization that his life was forever changed as he sat alone. He wondered how he'd ever move past this betrayal and if he could ever see Eliza the same way again. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built his life with, was now a stranger with a past he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wished he could. Grayson couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal and anger that burned inside him. Every time he looked at Eliza, he saw a stranger, a woman with secrets, a hidden life, and a dark past that he'd never known about days past. But his emotions only grew stronger no matter how much Eliza tried to explain. No matter how many times she told him she had changed, Grayson couldn't move past the hurt. The woman he had trusted, the person he had shared his life with, had been hiding something huge, and now he felt as though he'd been living a lie. One evening, Grayson came home late. He'd been driving around for hours trying to clear his head, but every thought kept circling back to Eliza and her hidden identity. When he finally walked through the door, he found her waiting for him in the living room, looking anxious and tired. It was clear she'd been crying. Her eyes were red, and she seemed nervous, like she was afraid of what he might say. "Grayson, can we please talk?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Grayson sighed, feeling the weight of the tension between them. Part of him wanted to just walk away, to leave all this behind and never look back. But another part of him needed answers that only she could provide. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. "Let's talk." They sat down across from each other, a heavy silence settling over the room. Eliza took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "Grayson, I know I hurt you. I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was scared. I thought I could start over, that we could build a life together without my past getting in the way." Grayson's face washed, his eyes unyielding. "You thought you could just erase your past?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Eliza looked down, wringing her hands nervously. "I didn't want you to find out because I didn't want to lose you. I love you, Grayson. I didn't want my mistakes to ruin everything, love." Grayson scoffed, anger flaring up again. "You lied to me for years, Eliza. You let me believe you were someone else. That's not love, that's betrayal." Eliza's face crumpled as tears began to flow. "Please, Grayson," she whispered. "I know we made mistakes, but I've changed. That life is behind me." Grayson shook his head, his fists clenched. "I don't even know who you are anymore. How do I know anything you say is true?" Eliza stood up, reaching out at him, her face desperate. "Grayson, please." But something in him snapped, all the anger, all the frustration, and all the heartbreak he'd been bottling up came rushing to the surface. He pulled away from her, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? You've made a fool out of me. I thought I knew you, Eliza. I thought we had something real, but now I don't even know who you are." Eliza took a step back, fear flickering in her eyes. "Grayson, please. Calm down. I'm still the same person." "So," he said sharply. "You're not. You're someone else entirely, someone I never would have chosen if I'd known the truth." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Eliza's face twisted with hurt, and Grayson could see her trembling. Her eyes filled with sorrow. She tried to reach out again, her hand barely touching his arm, but in that moment a surge of anger overtook him. All the betrayal, the lies, the feeling of having his life shattered in an instant. It was too much. He pushed her hand away, his emotions spiraling out of control. "You destroyed everything," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. Eliza stumbled back, startled by the intensity in his voice. She opened her mouth to speak, but Grayson, overcome with anger, took a step toward her, his body tense. He didn't even realize what he was doing. His mind was a blur of pain and rage. "Grayson, stop," she cried, backing away, but he was too lost in his emotions to listen. In a single tragic moment, Grayson's anger reached its peak. In the heat of the moment, he lashed out at him, striking her harder than he intended. Eliza gasped, stumbling backward, her face filled with shock and hurt. She tripped, falling backward and hitting her head against the edge of the coffee table with a sickening thud. The room went silent. Grayson's anger vanished in an instant, replaced by horror as he watched Eliza lying still on the floor. Her eyes closed, her face pale. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice choked with fear. "Eliza, please wake." But she didn't move. He reached out, touching her face, his heart pounding. She realized the terrible thing he had done. Tears filled his eyes as he sat there, frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. Grayson's mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, regret, sorrow. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He hadn't meant to lose control, but now as he looked at Eliza, in still form, he knew that his life would never be the same. In that tragic, heartbreaking moment, the weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders, leaving him with nothing but the cold, painful truth of what he had done, and as the silence enveloped him, he realized that he had lost everything: his wife, his love, and any hope for the future they'd once dreamed of together. The silence, after that terrible night, didn't last long. Soon enough, flashing red and blue lights lit up the quiet neighborhood. Breaking the usual peace, police officers warmed Grayson and Eliza's home, responding to a frantic 911 call from a shocked, trembling Grayson, who could barely believe what he'd done. The neighbors drawn to the chaos peeked out from behind curtains and doorways, whispers traveling like wildfire. People gasped and shook their heads in disbelief. Grayson, their respectable lawyer and trusted neighbor, was taken into custody, his wrists cuffed as he stared numbly at the ground, haunted by what had just happened. In the days that followed, the whole community was buzzing with shock and confusion. People couldn't stop talking about it, yet no one really knew what to say. Grayson had been the kind of guy everyone looked up to. He'd given legal advice to neighbors, hosted gatherings, and always seemed to have a kind word for anyone. Hemet and Eliza. She was the friendly artist who had brought so much color to their lives. But now she was gone, and Grayson, the man they thought they knew, was behind bars, facing serious charges. As news of the tragedy spread, more details about Eliza's hidden past surfaced. Reporters uncovered her real name, Julia Hayes, and her history that stretched back to a time before anyone in the neighborhood had known her. People were stunned. They learned that Eliza had been involved in criminal activities years ago, tied up in a world of theft and deception that no one could have imagined. The charming, kind artist they thought they knew was revealed to have a dark past, one she'd hidden carefully. Until now, the community was divided in their reactions. Some felt a strange sympathy for Grayson, understanding his shock and the betrayal he must have felt. They wondered how he must have struggled when he discovered Eliza's lies. Others felt that no matter what he'd learned about her past, Grayson's actions were inexcusable. He had taken a life, and nothing could justify that. Arguments broke out among neighbors who had once been close friends, each side torn between feeling sorry for Grayson and condemning him for what he had done. Grayson's trial was intense. News cameras captured every moment as he walked into the courthouse, looking pale and worn. Inside, he sat silently as the prosecutor described the events leading up to that fatal night. They portrayed Grayson as a man who had let his anger take over, who had lost control and made a terrible choice. Grayson's lawyer, however, argued that he was not a violent man by nature, but had been driven to the edge by the shocking secrets he had uncovered about his wife. The trial brought out all the emotions Grayson had been bearing since the night had happened. Witnesses, including some of his neighbors, were called to testify. They spoke about his character, his kindness, and his calm demeanor. Some neighbors described how he'd helped them with legal issues, often without expecting anything in return. They painted a picture of the Grayson they had known before the tragedy, trying to convince the jury that he wasn't a monster, but a man who had made a horrible, impulsive mistake. But as each new witness took the stand, more of Eliza's mysterious past was also exposed. Police officers and old acquaintances shared stories about her life as Julia Hayes. Her involvement in crimes she tried to leave behind. Eliza's past became a focal point, creating a complex, tangled web of emotions and moral questions. Grayson sat in the courtroom, listening to it all in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy burden. He couldn't look his former neighbors in the eyes, feeling ashamed and lost. The trial dragged on, with every day revealing new layers of the tragedy the jury was faced with. A difficult decision they had to consider: Grayson's spotless history against the shocking crime he'd committed, and they had to weigh the anger and betrayal he must have felt upon discovering his wife's hidden life against the fact that he had still taken a life. Some jurors seemed sympathetic, while others looked disturbed by what they'd heard. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as Everyone waited for the final verdict. After several long, tense days, the jury reached their decision. Thanks for watching True Crime Cases.